Há algumas verdades absolutas. O sentido da vida é difícil de encontrar. A infância é efêmera. E seguir coelhos brancos é um passatempo perigoso.
Ears and whiskers, how late it's getting. You're nothing but a thing in his dream. Speak when you're spoken to.
I wonder if I shall fall right through the
Chinese
earth.
come with awareness and to talk.
You might just as well say, I like what I get is the same as I get what I
I
like.
can't explain myself because I'm not myself, you see.
All the ways about here belong to me.
Beware the jabberwock, my son. The jaws that bite, the claws that catch.
All persons more than a mile high to leave the
Off with her head.
If you're going to turn into a pig, I'll have nothing more to do with
It's
you.
ridiculous to leave all the conversation to the pudding.
We're all mad here. I'm mad, you're
What is the
mad.
use of a book without pictures and conversations?
Alice no País das Maravilhas, versão brasileira Centauro. Grandes livros. Era um lânguido e ensolarado 4 de julho de 1862. Charles Dodgson levou Alice e Lido e suas duas irmãs no passeio de barco no Tamisa. Como fazia frequentemente, ele começou a contar uma história.
How in a desperate attempt to strike out some new line of fairy lore, I had sent my heroine straight down a rabbit hole, without the least idea what was to happen afterwards.
Aquele momento de magia no rio criou um mundo que mudaria o panorama da infância.
It is a book which has become embedded in our culture. It's very difficult to find anybody on the street who hasn't heard of Alice in Wonderland or knows something about the characters, even if they've never read the book.
Aqueles que leram o livro nunca esquecerão a viagem de Alice ao País das Maravilhas, um lugar onde se muda de tamanho e os gatos sorriem, onde um chapeleiro maluco serve chá e a rainha de copas joga croquet com flamingos. E isso foi só o começo. Num segundo livro, Alice passa através do espelho e chega num enorme jogo de xadrez e se defronta com criaturas tão estranhas como Jabberwock e tão familiares como Humpty Dumpty. As aventuras de Alice mexeram com a imaginação de leitores do mundo inteiro. Ao lado da Bíblia e de Shakespeare, Alice no País das Maravilhas e Através do Espelho são os livros mais citados da língua inglesa.
Jeshapus, would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?
That depends a good deal on where you want to get to.
I don't much care where,
Then it doesn't matter which way you go.
so long as I get somewhere.
Oh, you're sure to do that if you only walk long enough.
Lewis Carroll, pseudônimo do reverendo Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, encontrou seu caminho na Universidade de Oxford como estudante. Após se formar, ele recebeu uma bolsa dando-lhe o privilégio de passar o resto da vida lá. Como professor de matemática, Carroll era um cavalheiro vitoriano tímido e gago que nunca se casou e era profundamente religioso.
I don't think that he would have been easy to get on with. He had very stern and rigid ideas about how one should behave and how one should live and about relationships. He very formal in his way, especially with adults.
Enquanto o criador do País das Maravilhas era um homem diferente. brincalhão, irreverente e profundamente interessado em divertir meninas pequenas.
He likes all children, as long as they're girls. He's not too happy with boys. There's no sort of evidence why that should happen. Yes, he's from a large family and there are 7 sisters, but there are also 3 brothers, so he gets on very well with.
As a human being, he is spooky, I think. One of his little girlfriends says that a very clever man with the heart of, the brain of a very clever man and the heart of a child. And that's how he was. And of course, much of his life was in that sense, I think, I was going to say abnormal, but that's awful. What's normal? Let me say eccentric.
Carrol conheceu a família de Henry Liddell na Universidade de Oxford em 1856. O Sr. Liddell era reitor da Igreja Cristã, a faculdade onde Carrol ensinava matemática. Do alto da biblioteca da Igreja Cristã, um dia Carrol vislumbrou por acaso as filhas do reitor brincando. Anotou o dia em seu diário. Elas o impressionaram muito.
The 3 little girls were in the garden most of the time, and we became excellent friends. I marked this day with a white stone.
Foi Alice Liddell, de 4 anos, que Carrol achou especialmente cativante, tanto que inspirou sua própria imortalidade.
After Alice had said, "Mr. Dodgson, would you write that story down for me?" Clearly, a request he could not refuse. He spent the following day writing all the chapter headings out, very carefully noting all the main features of the book.
Mas que tipo de livro Carrol estava escrevendo? As Aventuras de Alice são uma celebração divertida do absurdo ou os sonhos obsessivos de um autor atormentado? Alice se esquiva das respostas facilmente.
She's drowning in tears and platypuses and doors being closed on her and things getting larger and smaller and swimming through keyholes and off with your head and decks of soldier cards falling apart. And she reacts to it, but it's all sort of fascinating. And there's a part of her that seems to enjoy and want more of it. It's a thirst, a curiosity, a thirst for life in all its forms.
What a curious feeling. It must be shutting up like a telescope.
And so it was indeed. She was now only 10 inches high, and her face brightened up at the thought that she was now the right size for going through the little door into the lovely garden.
Alice in Wonderland is really an allegory of the journey of life, in a way, or the journey of a child growing up. And he's saying to that child, stick with it, you'll come through all right.
Carrol levou 2 anos e meio para terminar a história depois daquele passeio de barco. No Natal de 1864, Carrol deu de presente a Alice As Aventuras Subterrâneas de Alice, escrito e ilustrado por ele mesmo. A exatidão das suas ilustrações foi o resultado de passar horas estudando livros de história natural. Animado pelos amigos, Carrol resolveu divulgar e publicar sua obra, mas estava insatisfeito com as ilustrações originais e foi procurar um artista profissional. Escolheu bem. Os desenhos de John Tenniel se tornaram tão famosos quanto a própria história, publicada em 1865 e reintitulada Alice no País das Maravilhas.
Strangely enough, there was more comment on the Tenniel pictures rather than the Alice text, because Tenniel was very well known, whereas Lewis Carroll wasn't. Tenniel was known as a Punch cartoonist, and this was his first venture into that type of book, and I think people were intrigued by that. And again, it does reflect how seriously Lewis Carroll took the book that he chose as one of the leading cartoonists in the whole country, which is quite unusual.
Os desenhos de Tenniel eram tão populares que Carrol o convenceu a ilustrar também Alice através do espelho. Centenas de artistas seguiram o exemplo de Tenniel em dar vida à história. Foi alicerçada a base para o Império de Alices. Alice tem inspirado balés e espetáculos de marionetes, teatro e vídeos musicais. Uma das adaptações mais incomuns foi este filme de Jonathan Miller. A infância de Carrol insinuava sua futura transformação, de professor a contador de histórias. Era um irmão atento e carinhoso com as irmãs, inventando jogos e histórias para diverti-las. Começou cedo sua carreira literária. Aos 13 anos, escreveu e ilustrou a primeira de uma série de revistas que criou especialmente para sua família. A vida em Oxford foi uma mudança dramática do lugar campestre de sua infância. Parecia um lugar sombrio para um escritor de tanta fantasia. Talvez sua solenidade o tenha motivado.
One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter. Of the mushroom.
No! Even smaller!
Try the other side.
Falar de cogumelos mágicos que o fazem crescer ou diminuir levanta as suspeitas de algumas pessoas de que o bom reverendo tomasse drogas.
I have one friend I can think of who is now in England, believes that he did, and believes that there is evidence, and indeed adds that he thinks he may have given them to the children, which is a sort of slightly hair-raising thought. I don't know. I personally don't know at all. What one does know, of course, is how easy drugs were to obtain.
Did Lewis Carroll smoke pot? You know, it's a natural question given that scene. But he didn't. He didn't have to. He didn't need that kind of stimulus. He had it all built in automatically, and his imagination soared without stimulants.
Seja qual for a fonte da inspiração de Carrol, Grace Slick e sua banda Jefferson Airplane drogaram Alice. A canção Coelho Branco foi um sucesso em 1967.
One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small, and the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall.
There are magic mushrooms. There's a hookah. There are 4 or 5 different styles of getting loaded in that book. I think the caterpillar is probably the most obvious because of his character and because he is not only smoking opium, but he's sitting on a psychedelic mushroom.
John Lennon também era fascinado por Lewis Carroll.
John Lennon had a very similar, rather bizarre sense of humour, and some of John Lennon's early poetry reflects a similar sort of Carrollian style. When they did the Sgt. Pepper album, all 4 Beatles were asked, who are your favourite characters? Because we'll actually include them on the front cover of the album, and Lewis Carroll is there.
Os anos 60 fizeram de Alice uma rebelde, audaciosa em sua busca de diversão.
Alice was a good character in that she didn't freak out over any of this stuff. She would get a very human concern about it. She'd say, "Oh dear me, I think my feet are getting..." But she didn't freak out. It was just noticing. She's just noticing that things are quite different. And I think that gives people the opportunity to see that you're not going to fall apart, you're not going to go nuts if your reality changes.
Telemahoka, smoking caterpillar has given you a call, Alice, when she was just small.
Quando Carrol era pequeno, o Império Britânico já estava em condições de começar a sua grande época, a da Rainha Vitória. Ela foi um modelo poderoso. Moralista, sombria e determinada, e sua influência não passou despercebida a Alice. Apesar do conservadorismo vitoriano, a Inglaterra vibrava com as mudanças. A Revolução Industrial e Política perturbou uma forma de vida que era tranquila e confortável. O mundo estava ao avesso.
Here's an age where class distinctions, which are so cherished by the English, are fluid suddenly. Who's in what class? Here's an age in which an assurance that man, for example, is superior to all the rest of creation, that has to deal with evolutionary theory, Darwin and others saying, you just go look at those skulls in the museum and you see where we are. We're just a step above the apes. And so these very proper and self-important Victorians have to deal with that.
If everybody minded their own business, the world would go round a good deal faster than it does.
Which would not be an advantage. Just think what work it would make with the day and night. You see, the Earth takes 24 hours to turn round on its axis.
Talking of axes, chop off her head.
Very generous for letting us come with.
Meninas independentes que questionavam a autoridade foram contra a Inglaterra vitoriana, onde a infância era uma fase da vida a ser tolerada, não necessariamente usufruída. A história de Alice deu às crianças uma liberdade inesperada.
The children's books up to that time were very didactic. They were there to instill moral, cultural, social standards which had been preset, dominated by the church. So many of the children's books were actually produced by church organizations. So they're very moral. And suddenly, here is Alice in a story which has no morals in it, apart from the morals that the Duchess talks about. And of course, they're spoof morals, they're not real morals. So yes, I think children suddenly thought, a breath of fresh air here. Here is quite a different story.
A visão pouco convencional de Carrol da infância também encontrou expressão na nova forma de arte, a fotografia. Suas fotos sensuais de suas amiguinhas são vistas por alguns como perturbadoras e por outros como geniais.
Because of his engaging manner, his way of relaxing children, telling them stories and throwing puns at them and asking them quizzical questions, he diverts their attention and he's able to get them to sit still in interesting, relaxed positions. And so he produces some of the most beautiful child photographs that have ever been made.
His greatest interest was in photographing little girls, and this was an entree. He could ask Mama if it was all right for him to photograph a little girl. Then later on, he could write another letter saying, could he photograph her in a costume? And eventually he would work up like a lover to saying, could he photograph this child in the nude? We know that, of course, he was refused sometimes, but it's astounding at how many mothers said, go ahead.
Em uma carta a uma destas mães, Carrol falou com adoração de suas jovens modelos.
Their innocent unconsciousness is very beautiful and gives one a feeling of reverence, as if in the presence of something sacred.
Carrol passou 25 anos revelando fotografias, criando uma coleção de mais de 2.000 fotos. De repente abandonou o passatempo sem explicação, levando as pessoas a especularem da sua intenção para com as modelos.
Subconsciously, who knows what was going on? There must have been some sexual side to it, perhaps, but very much under control, perhaps too much under control. It was definitely a voyeurist looking. It was look, not touch.
We have to think ourselves back 150 years almost to grasp the kind of mentality that existed before Freud. And there weren't the suspicions then that there are today. And we're a lot more self-conscious about sexual, inner, subconscious, psychic, sexual motives than they were.
É irônico que o mestre do disparate tenha sido professor de lógica. Primeiro, Carrol foi matemático, o que deve ser uma surpresa para os que o conheceram como o criador de Alice.
Queen Victoria, having read the first book, said, "I would like to read the next book by this author." The next book by the author was an elementary treatise on simultaneous linear equations and their application to, it's actually deriving determinants. Now, I don't think he sent that to Queen Victoria. She would not have been amused, I'm sure.
A obra matemática mais famosa de Carrol, Lógica Simbólica, foi uma mostra de seu exercício intelectual favorito, o silogismo, duas premissas e sua conclusão. Os valores são trocados. Se M é igual a gato, X é igual a francês e Y igual a galinha. O gato fala francês. Algumas galinhas são gatos. Portanto, algumas galinhas falam francês. A premissa é verdadeira.
The basic concept is that you have a totally absurd situation that couldn't possibly happen as a major premise to start with, like a rabbit runs by wearing clothes and with a watch and talking and runs down a rabbit hole and you run down after it. Now, you take on that grand premise and then everything else follows.
Na Inglaterra vitoriana, a hora do chá era uma instituição cultural, uma hora de importância apropriada para a cena mais famosa do País das Maravilhas.
Sit down, have some wine.
There isn't any wine.
Of course not. We've no time for wine, we've no time for anything. Doesn't work, see? Not a tick.
He quarrelled with time last March.
And ever since that, he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now.
Time stop and things go backwards is a theme of the surrealistic movement, and Salvador Dali in particular had this fascination for clocks and very funny shaped clocks. Dali even went and produced his own Alice with some very interesting illustrations.
It's so easy to use Alice as an artist, regardless of what you're singing, writing, Salvador Dali, John Lennon, because it has a wonderful panoply of stuff to reorganize, identify with, rearrange, to put yourself into any of the characters. It's fun to be the Mad Hatter, the mouse, the dormouse, Alice, the White Rabbit. It's a spectacular book.
Carrol jogava frequentemente croquet com as crianças e até inventou uma versão complicada do jogo. Em Alice no País das Maravilhas, esta diversão inofensiva toma um rumo grotesco.
The players all played at once, without waiting for turns, quarrelling all the while and fighting for the hedgehogs. And in a very short time, the Queen was in a furious passion and went stamping about and shouting, "Off with his head," or "Off with her head," about once a minute.
Quem roubou as tortas? Perguntaram quando Alice apareceu diante da corte corrupta da Rainha de Copas. Uma situação séria logo cai no ridículo.
In any solemn ceremony, something funny ought to happen. Something ought just to break in. I vow there's some demon who sees to that. You know, and goodness, one does enjoy it. You know, it's lovely to have the great, majestic, pompous things. That's fine. They have their place. But how nice just to go whoops, you know, and shake everybody up.
Alice no País das Maravilhas vendeu bem. Proporcionou a Carrol uma renda tão confortável que ele pediu à igreja cristã que lhe reduzisse o salário. Mas seu sucesso o incomodou tanto que Dodgson se recusou a aceitar cartas dirigidas a Lewis Carroll.
I think that was to protect not only himself, but Alice and the other people who could be identified as Oxford characters within the book. Also, he did not like the limelight. He did not like people to make a fuss of him. He was a very modest person, and I think he would have found it quite difficult to handle if people kept coming up and asked for his autograph and made a fuss because he was the famous author of Alice's Adventures.
Alice e seus personagens também a tornaram famosa. Suas aventuras foram traduzidas em várias línguas, do árabe ao Zulu.
It is not set in a particular historical time or place like Little Lord Fauntleroy or Little Women or some of the other books that we think of when we think of 19th century children's books. Because of that, you don't have to be from Victorian England to understand it. You can understand it you can get things out of it if you're French or German or Dutch or Italian or Russian or Japanese.
Charles Lutwidge possui uma coleção formidável dos livros de Alice. Viaja o mundo todo lendo suas aventuras.
It's a book that has very successfully fed on its own image because it's able to cross over into other media, film, television, advertising, spoken recordings, radio. Another thing that's made it so popular is the thing we can't put our finger on. George Plimpton called it the X factor when he was writing about athletics and business, that certain something that distinguishes a champion from second place. And if you knew what it was, you could make a lot of money publishing books or making movies. But whatever it is, I think Alice has definitely got it.
Há uma organização internacional de fãs da Alice. Maxine e David Schiffer dedicam-se à sua coleção de livros. Maxine é bibliotecária da seção de paródias.
The collection as a whole is both my husband's and mine, and he had the parodies, and the parodies were sort of pushing us out of the bookcase, so he said he was going to give them away. And I said, you can't do that. So he said, fine, you take the parodies. So I've taken the parodies, and I'm having fun collecting different versions. And when you collect books on Alice, you find all sorts of things that you can buy. Memorabilia encompasses an awful lot. So you have to stop somewhere or start somewhere.
This collection here is 102 years old at the moment. And it was started by my mother in 1891.
Schiffer tem livros em mais de 50 idiomas, mas sua especialidade é Alice no cinema. Sua coleção de 30 filmes começa com a produção de Cecil Hepworth em 1903.
Here is a picture of Alice getting, well, she's small right here looking at the large table. But in 1903, people didn't have human beings getting smaller and larger. This is probably the very first time anybody had ever tried that. You use two films, you superimpose one on the other, you keep the background constant, and you pull the camera away.
Em 1910, a companhia Edison filmou Alice no Bronx. Esta Alice de 1915 estreou com o acompanhamento de uma orquestra de 30 instrumentos. Alice no País das Maravilhas, do livro de Lewis Carroll. Ao contrário dos primeiros filmes, não foram usados efeitos especiais para mudar o tamanho. Assim, Alice seria sempre a mais alta da cena. Atores anões representavam os animais. Depois de Alice no País das Maravilhas, uma sombra toldou a vida de Carrol. Sua relação com os Liddles esfriou de repente.
We're not certain what happened. The relevant diaries for that period are missing. It's a time when the relationship with the Little family is in full bloom, and we know afterwards, when the diaries restart, that the relationship is extremely cool.
Alice Little's mother was society with a big S, and I think she saw herself as socially superior to Lewis Carroll. Although people say, oh, well, he was just a mathematical lecturer, and mathematical Don in Oxford still had quite a status. They sat at the high table, they were part of the staff in authority. I think it was Mrs. Little who possibly objected to any possible relationship with Alice that Lewis Carroll might be thinking about.
Depois que Carroll parou de ver Alice, foi em busca de inúmeras meninas encantadoras, mas a lembrança de Alice nunca o abandonou. Quando ela se casou, confiou-lhe em uma carta.
I've had scores of child friends since your time, but they have been quite a different thing.
Apesar do rompimento com sua musa, 6 anos depois de seu primeiro livro, Carroll escreveu a segunda parte das Aventuras de Alice, através do espelho, e o que Alice encontrou lá.
He saw it as a sequel to Alice, but it's a structured book now. It's based on the game of chess. Underneath it, there seems to be this view that his Alice, as the pawn, moves across the board and becomes queen. An analogy of Alice growing up, becoming an adult, and for Lewis Carroll to lose her.
Mais uma vez, Alice sonha com um mundo mágico.
Dreams are an avenue to a kind of knowledge that cannot be achieved by the conscious mind. And Charles Dodgson was very committed to the conscious approach to knowledge. And this, to a certain extent, satisfies that other need, his recognition that there were kinds of things we knew in a dream state that we cannot know in a waking state. Besides that, it seems to me, he's tapped into what is essential for our lives. We now know that if you do not dream, you go crazy.
These books where dream states or situations where people are thrown into extraordinary circumstances hopefully give people the idea that they too can experience radical changes in their life or even plan to do so. Not just as a reaction to something that's happening to you, but something you think, maybe I just ought to flip this over.
Toda a vida passa da direita para a esquerda no mundo dos espelhos. Até a poesia é lida de trás para frente, como aprende Alice quando aborda Jabberwock.
'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the moon raths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the Jub-Jub bird, and shun the frumious Bandersnatch.
I think it's a masterpiece of real nonsense poetry. He made up words which sound right, even though they're not right, until you've explained them, that is. And they're in a rigid poetic structure so that you understand the words, even though you don't understand the words, which is what Alice says. She said it seems to have a lot of meaning in it, but I don't quite know what it is.
I don't know if you would call it onomatopoetic. I think I just made that word up, but it's close. In that, it doesn't seem to make any sense, but it sounds like somebody describing early morning. 'Twas brillig in the slithy toves. Brillig sounds like a description of the light. It was bright, but maybe a little foggy. Slithy toves sounds like trees that have moss and stuff hanging on them. So I see a scene, an early morning scene in a forest, although it makes absolutely no sense. So I liked it very much as a child, and I like the way it sounds to repeat it. I like just hearing it. So that's probably my favorite.
Carroll deu definições para as palavras Jabberwock. Na verdade, ajudaram muito. Depois de substituir as definições de Carroll, a mensagem do poema se esclarece. Escutem.
"'Twas dinner time, and the smooth and active badgers did scratch and bore holes in the hillside. All unhappy were the parrots, and the grave land turtles squeaked.
Carrol amava o idioma, amava a palavra escrita. Seu registro tem quase 100.000 cartas mandadas e recebidas durante a vida. Algumas foram escritas em espiral. Outras só podiam ser lidas com um espelho. E outras foram ilustradas com criaturas fantásticas. As coisas nunca são como deveriam na Terra dos Espelhos. O mundo fica distorcido e os personagens de uma canção de ninar lutam até a morte.
Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle.
Perto do campo de batalha, o Rei Vermelho está roncando sob uma árvore. A discussão sobre o chocalho de Tweedledum é adiada para que os gêmeos possam atormentar Alice.
Dumbledore says to Alice, "Do you know what would happen if he woke up? You're just a thing in his dream, and you'd go out like a candle," and she begins to cry. But indeed, whose dream is it?
Desde que Alice sonha sua aventura no espelho, sonha com o rei, que sonha com ela. Em um estranho e breve retorno à realidade, Carrol pinta seu autorretrato no personagem do Cavaleiro Branco, que acabou de duelar com o Cavaleiro Vermelho. Um cavaleiro valente, mas desajeitado, se despede de Alice, que vai se tornar rainha.
There's a poignancy about that. And I think he was looking back on what might have been with Alice. I think the farewell scene, where you will wave your handkerchief to me, it'll encourage me. And she turns back for one moment and sees him standing there. I think that is a personal feeling, because it's quite different from anything else in the entire book. It's a lovely moment.
A afeição melancólica do Cavaleiro Branco sugere um homem muito apaixonado.
In love. Dodgy. Dodgy question, isn't it? That he loved her, yes. Deeply. I mean, I think I would say passionately.
It depends what you mean by love. I think he did love her, but he loved her in the same way that a father would love a daughter. The part that really excited him was the precocity, the intellect. Yes, and the physical features of the child. She was an attractive-looking girl, but so were the other sisters. But Alice was his favourite, because Alice had a mind of her own. She was an independent little girl, and she would ask him questions.
Alice chega à última fileira do tabuleiro, onde é coroada a rainha. Para festejar sua coroação, participa de uma ceia que rapidamente fica fora de controle.
The ending of Looking Glass, I think, really moves towards madness and gets very frightening. You know, where the leg of mutton gets off the dish and comes and sits in the chair, and the Red Queen has shrunk to about 3 inches high, is running around the table, and the bottles have got wings and are beginning to fly, and the candles are growing. Oi! It gives one slightly the shivers.
You look a little shy. Let me introduce you to that leg of mutton. Alice. Mutton, mutton, Alice.
May I give you a slice?
Certainly not. It isn't etiquette to cut anyone you've been introduced to. Remove the joint.
I can't stand this anymore.
Mais uma vez, Alice precisa escapar do seu pesadelo. Desesperada, começa a sacudir a rainha, que se transforma num gato, cujo ronronar a acorda. O final de Através do Espelho é mais do que o final de uma história. A rainha Alice ganhou o jogo de xadrez e Lewis Carroll perdeu seu sonho.
I think Lewis Carroll realized that at some stage the relationship that he had with children would change, that they would grow up, they would go their separate way, and he'd be left alone.
A verdadeira Alice cresceu, mas a história de Alice anula sua mortalidade. Através de seus sonhos, podemos viver outra vez a infância e fugir por um momento dos demônios que vêm com a idade.
The books are subversive of all sorts of things, and one of the delights of the books is a subversion of grown-ups, grown-up behavior. The grown-ups in these books are clearly shown to be infantile in many ways. It's Alice who moves through those stages to a kind of maturity. The fact that they are subversive helps to explain their popularity. We need a kind of subversiveness. We need it somewhere or other. We need to overthrow in carnival or whatever it is the rules of the game and play in some place outside those rules.
As aventuras de Alice brincam entre a realidade e a fantasia. Talvez sejam apenas sonhos que atormentam. Por sua natureza, cada conto de fadas guarda seu sentido para si.
You can see it as a classic of humour, as a classic of logic, as a classic children's book, as a classic of parody. And there's an element of truth in all of these. But you mustn't get so lost into an academic approach to the book that you forget the way that the book was originally written. That he was writing a children's book for a particular child.
Lewis Carroll recordou essa criança no poema final de Através do Espelho.
Long has paled that sunny sky, echoes fade and memories die, autumn frosts have slain July. Still she haunts me, phantom-wise, Alice moving under skies never seen by waking eyes. Thank you.